Good morning and welcome to today's webcast of the Environment Committee. Hello to members, guests and anyone watching this on the live stream. This meeting will be taken informally on a virtual basis with Assembly members and guests participating remotely. We will not take formal decisions or agree the minutes of the committee's meeting on 28th of June 2020, which were included in the published agenda. Instead, the meetings will be deferred to the next formal meeting of the committee, but I'm happy to take any inquiries or comments of that item. For transparency, we will still declare any interests and we're also able to note items. I'll call Assembly members to speak by name during the Q&A session. Could I ask everyone to check that their electronic devices are switched to silent mode and that their microphones are switched to mute when they are not talking to avoid any interruptions? Can I now ask our clerk if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies have been received.
Thank you very much. Agenda item 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if any members have any other interest to declare? I can see hands from Assembly Member Clark and Cooper. Assembly Member Clark.
Yeah, I'm a customer of London Power and I'm also an investor in Power Up North London at their Hampstead School solar project.
Thank you for your transparency. And Assembly Member Cooper.
Very similar. I'm a customer of London Power, which features in the agenda. I don't consider it to be a pecuniary interest. And I am also a member of and an investor in CREW, which is Community Renewable Energy Wandsworth. Again, similarly, I don't consider it to be a pecuniary interest, but for full transparency, just want to get that out there on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Agenda item 3, minutes. As mentioned, we are unable to agree today the minutes of the meeting held on 28th of June. Does anyone have any comments? I see shaking heads. I will keep moving then. Thank you very much. Agenda item 4, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and outstanding actions arising from its previous meetings and additional correspondence received?
Noted.
Thank you very much. Section 5, the Mayor's response to Too Good to Waste. That was our Environment Committee report. Can I ask the committee to note the Mayor's response to the Too Good to Waste report?
Noted.
Noted.
Thank you very much. Section 6, renewable energy. We can now move on to our main item of business. Thank you everyone, especially our guests, for their patience. This is the discussion with invited guests on renewable energy. I would like to welcome our panel of guests and thank them for joining us virtually today. We have Catherine Barber, who's Assistant Director of Environment and Energy, Greater London Authority, the GLA, and Chetan Ladd, the Interim Head of Energy, GLA. Welcome both back to the committee. We're also joined today by Syed Ahmed, OBE, who is Director of Energy for London. Welcome, Syed. Note we were due to be joined by Dale Vince, OBE, who's founder of Ecotricity, who has been injured. And so I'm sure I can join the whole committee in wishing him a quick recovery, and sadly he won't be with us today. Jumping then straight into the main business, which is our questions. I would like to turn to Syed actually. Syed, where are the strategic challenges, do you believe, that are specific to London that are making it harder for us to increase our renewable energy supply?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for inviting me on today. And it's sad to hear about Dale's injury, and I wish him a speedy recovery if he's actually watching this online at the moment. And hopefully you'll be able to hear some of his input via written submission afterwards, if that is possible for him. So some of the challenges in London are, I think, fairly obvious to many of the committee. It's the fact that we're in a very built urban environment, and therefore a number of the renewable technologies, which you can see populated across the country, don't have the same ability to be used in London's environment as elsewhere. So I'm talking predominantly about wind. I mean, we have 1 or 2 instances of wind over in East London and West London. They are really, kind of one-offs, and we don't envisage any kind of significant increase in the amount of wind energy in London. So the built environment provides that challenge to some of these developments, but it also provides an opportunity for other areas, particularly around solar. And I've got a feeling, as we're talking about renewable energy, solar will be one of the principal technologies we'll be focusing on in today's discussion. However, though there has been made some really good progress in terms of solar over the last decade, still London, is below many other regions in terms of the capacity, and we can discuss that as the session goes on. There are other opportunities as well around waste, especially around anaerobic digestion. But just to say, apart from the urban environment challenge, a key issue that I really want to get over to colleagues here today is that many of the technologies that we've seen rapidly grow and increase in capacity across the UK have been supported by subsidy mechanisms by the government. But when you look at those subsidy mechanisms, they're not well suited to supporting these types of projects within urban areas. So when you look at the history of these subsidy mechanisms go back 20 years to the renewables obligation, and that was principally about onshore wind and landfill gas. Again, not terribly conducive to London's environment. Same with feed-in tariffs. Feed-in tariffs did spur on a lot of activity, but they're principally supporting larger scale projects in fields. Again, not something that we're going to have an opportunity in London. And it goes on for the renewable, contracts for differences, CFDs, the renewable heat incentive, and other support mechanisms as well. When policymakers look at these policy mechanisms, they're geared up to bringing on as much capacity as possible in the most cost-efficient way, but they don't take that granular look to see to what extent they will play a role in different parts of the country. And London has lost out on renewable incentives as it has lost out, and I know the committee has looked at this in detail in the past, at energy efficiency incentives. I'll stop there for the moment, Zach, but hopefully it gives you a flavour. One, the urban environment, two, the nature of the subsidy mechanisms and their design.
That was a really good opening. Thank you very much, very helpful. And yes, just to reiterate to the committee that we will write to Dale Vince for submitted evidence as well. So thank you very much, Syed. Catherine, if I can turn to you and essentially ask, what are the GLA planning to do about these challenges?
Thanks, Zach. Yes, I mean, just to agree with Syed, of course, solar is the renewable source that is best fitted for London's built environment, the amount of space that we have. And that's why the Mayor has got such a large focus on that particular renewable energy through his solar action plan, which we can come on and talk about. Beyond solar, there's fairly limited potential for renewable generation in London, and we'll keep importing most of our power. So one of the challenges that we face is working with network operators to make sure that we can get the electricity in to where it's needed, and use flexibility to manage the system locally and plan for London's rapid move towards a net zero economy and an energy system. And one of the things that the GLA spends its time doing is talking to the regulator, talking to Ofgem and to central government about what it means, the fact that we want to go to net zero by 2030, whereas the country as a whole has got a 2050 target. So that is important to us. We know that investing in flexibility in Greater London can make savings both for Londoners in terms of reduced distribution costs, but also nationally in terms of system savings. So there are some opportunities there in terms of the support that we give to heat networks, battery storage, EV charging, and then also the demand side measures that we promote, including through the London Plan. So that's quite a broad picture of actions that the Mayor and the GLA are involved in. But I think just to say in terms of context as well, what we've seen in the wholesale energy market in the last year, last 2 years, first of all, the volatility due to COVID, and then the return to growth, which pushed energy prices right up, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has also just caused an unprecedented price spike. That is really motivated the Mayor to double down on this push for renewable energy and energy efficiency. You know, some people are sort of talking about should we be reinvesting in fossil fuels because, you know, they might be able to come on stream locally. We don't see that as an option. It's against the net zero direction, and it's also not going to help with energy prices in the short term or medium term. And by 2030, we're supposed to be off them entirely.
Thank you. I can see I've got a hand from Assembly Member Cooper. I'm just going to finish off the questioning and then I'll come in with her intervention. You mentioned there the invasion of Ukraine and the spike on prices. Can I ask, how is this affecting the GLA's ability for long-term procurement contracts? And if you could talk to that, that would be great.
Sure. So the GLA, well, the GLA group is looking at power purchase agreements to supply its renewable energy, renewable electricity. You'll have seen that last month TfL went live with its first PPA procurement, and that is for new build renewable capacity. And that is actually less affected by the volatility in the wholesale energy market and energy prices. It's more driven by the cost of construction, because TfL are essentially investing in buying from a renewable, new renewable plant, whether that's wind or solar. And that is the intention for the GLA group as a whole, once we start doing collaborative power purchase as well.
Thank you. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I was planning to come in a bit later, and I may still do that. It was actually just a question for Saeed. He didn't mention hydro, and I wondered if he thought there were any possibilities, because there is a rather large river that flows through the middle of London, which he may be familiar with. It's called the Thames. But there are also a number of tributaries that are quite large. We've got a large one in Wandsworth. It starts in Croydon and comes through Sutton and Merton as well, the Wandle. And Wandsworth actually exists because there was use made of the energy water wheels. There were many of them on Mill Road. There's still one operational in Merton at Merton Abbey Mills. So are there any possibilities for hydro that we're failing to exploit? And one for Catherine. When Said was making his remarks, he made a very glancing reference to anaerobic digestion, AD. And the first Mayor of London had a policy that he wanted to see AD in every borough. I don't think that's ever been followed up, or it certainly wasn't achieved under him and not been followed up by the second mayor. And I'm not sure where we are in terms of support for AD coming from the mayor at the moment. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. So should we go to Saeed first, and then we'll come to you, Catherine? Saeed.
Thanks for your question, Leonie. So hydro, just to say, I'm down on today's kind of agendas, the Director of Energy for London. I'm also the Chair of Community Energy London. And so that's a network of around about 25 to 30 groups around the capital that are delivering community energy projects. And hopefully we'll turn to that later on in the session. So just to say, one of the formative groups of Community Energy London was a group called Ham Hydro, working around Teddington in West London. And they were an excellent group of individuals who are trying to develop a hydro scheme there. And just to give you a flavour of what happened, they developed an idea of a project, and I can send you the details of it post-meeting, around Teddington. And unfortunately, there was a social club for, I think, one of the big oil companies, literally just opposite where the planned project was. And after many years of discussions with that neighbour to the project failed and the group collapsed. So to your question, Leonie, yes, there are opportunities. It would be good if some of the organisations with regard to the River Thames could look at the potential of this, because I'm not aware of a study in the last few years from the Port of London Authority or other kind of organisations involved with the Thames. So there are opportunities. There are community groups who are rising to the challenge, but there doesn't seem to be a conducive environment in certain locations for them to be able to do these projects. And so if there was, there might be more of an opportunity. Just to say, that project was during the time that we had feed-in tariffs. We do not have feed-in tariffs anymore. And so the economics of developing such a project are that much more challenging. And the community energy sector in general across England has virtually no support from government at all, but it's even more difficult in London. And it's only through the mayor's...
Probably ought to stop you on the community energy front, because you're quite right. There is there's a whole section of questions later And I'm glad you mentioned ham hydro, because I was thinking about those when I asked you and wondered if you knew of anyone else. And my belief is they raised about £750,000 for that project, which all then went to waste because they weren't able to move it ahead. So the concept of doing a study to assess whether or not hydro could be installed is maybe something that I can also then transfer on to my other question to Catherine. Maybe she could talk about that as well as about the possibilities for AD.
Thank you. If we go to Catherine, and I've got a hand from Chatham as well. Catherine.
Thank you. A fascinating question, Assembly Member Cooper. I have to say that in the 9 months since I joined the GLA, I've not heard anybody talk about a project that involved hydro or anaerobic digestion. Having said that, I believe that either of them could potentially be eligible for funding through the local, the London Community Energy Fund or the local energy accelerator, seeing as they meet those renewable energy generation criteria. But I've not seen that we've sponsored any, so I will go back and check that for you to see if we have. I think that Chet has come across at least one example of an AD project that was installed on land owned by the Mayor of London. So perhaps I'll invite him to come in if I may.
Thanks, Catherine. On hydro, I guess because the Thames is such a sort of tidal river, it's quite difficult to do your kind of standard run of the river type hydro generation schemes. But I'm surprised there's not been more on the tributaries. But we can have a look at what some of those. I'm not so familiar about what some of the barriers are on that. On AD. I think there are a few AD plant around the outskirts of out parts of London in terms of sort of waste to energy. So come across sort of one sort of developed about 7 or 8 years ago in Dagenham, sort of on a site owned by the Mayor of London, which has capacity to process up to 50,000 tonnes a year of food and green waste. So it's taking food waste that would otherwise go to landfill, and capturing the methane and making that into electricity. So again, as Catherine says, we haven't sort of talked about it a lot here, but I imagine projects are being brought forward.
Thank you, Syed.
Thanks.
Cheers. 2 quick things. There are 2 excellent AD schemes in London. One is the one that Chet mentioned, which is the Refood scheme in Dagenham Dock. It started operation around about 5 years ago. It's a real state-of-the-art plant taking food waste from large parts of East London. And ideally, we should be having more of those types of schemes on land in London, especially as we will hopefully be having the Environment Act requiring local authorities to collect food waste as of spring 2023, even though DEFRA has been, I think, quite late in setting out the rules and regulations for local authorities for that actually to happen. If the committee hasn't visited the Refood scheme, I do recommend a visit. And just to mention, I did find it odd that your Too Good to Waste report didn't mention AD actually, because this is one of the real opportunities for London to capture not only renewable power, but also renewable gas. And just to say, the second scheme is in Mitcham, which is biocollectors, and both the Refood scheme and the biocollectors scheme, they're highly innovative because what they do is they take biogas that's produced from the AD plant, they upgrade it to grid quality gas, and then they inject it into the gas grid. The biocollector scheme is even more innovative because it also uses combined heat and power to produce power as well, and it kind of arbitrages between producing renewable gas or power depending on what the wholesale prices dictate. So we've got some sophisticated plants in London. There's an awful lot of opportunity for a lot more, perhaps not to the regional mayors, one in every borough, but certainly for an increase over what we have at the moment.
Thanks, Syed, and thanks for mentioning biocollectors in my constituency. They're always happy to welcome people. In fact, I went with the Environment Audit Committee from the House of Commons, and I'm sure if we wanted to go as the Environment Committee, they'd be delighted to welcome us. They've been expanding, and not only do they have the innovations you've mentioned, they're now powering all their vehicles with gas that are created. So they are a totally circular and almost no footprint now in terms of their energy. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chair. And if I get interrupted by drilling, I apologise in advance. I've got the builders downstairs, not my property, I stress. My question is to Catherine Barber. The committee is aware that there's been challenges in my part of London, West London, in obtaining electricity connections for new homes. Given these challenges and other wider events, do you believe the London Energy Plan published in 2016 is still relevant, please?
Yes, thank you. We're aware of those issues in West London in particular, and it's something that the Mayor has taken up personally. I know that obviously we've got both housing developments wanting to connect to the grid, and then also particularly the issue in West London that we've seen is data centres, which are very energy intensive, and we're working with them on their energy efficiency, but nonetheless that economic activity, which we all want to see, does put a pressure on the grid as well. I think what's really important is that we're able to communicate to the distribution network operators and to Ofgem the sheer scale of demand that there's going to be, both because London is growing as an economy, but also because of the net zero requirements, and the fact that people are now, when they're building homes, they're also thinking about the EV charging and that kind of greater electrification of both of heating and transport and the rest. So it is a real pressure. My understanding is that where there's a clear sign of demand, the supply responds, but we have to be really convincing to the DNOs and to Ofgem that we're serious about net zero, and so the investment that is needed in West London and across the city happens.
Thank you. I started my career in energy, so I know what DNOs are, but I'm not sure how many viewers and listeners will. Can I do what I often do on these calls and apologise to my colleagues and ask maybe we could have a nice simple process chart in terms of who does what in the energy space, what influences the GLA can actually make on these issues, but a nice simple chart, because these meetings are also about trying to communicate to wider Londoners rather than us sustainability nerds. Thank you for that. And then moving on to Said, please. And I often also wish Dale best wishes on his recovery. Said, what policies should the Mayor be adopting to transition to renewable energy supply? And are there any innovative projects London can learn from, please?
Thank you, Tony, for that question. So I think first of all, energy is a complex area, and the Mayor has limited powers in terms of what he can do, as I'm sure you all well know. And it's been one of the challenges, not only on energy, but on a number of other areas for London to really kind of capitalise on the potential that it has. In terms of policies, the Mayor's been the Mayor's been making good examples of new builds through the London plan. So new build is where there are great key examples of what you can do to build low carbon net zero buildings with a high proportion of energy generation on them. What we really need to be doing is looking for London's existing buildings, and the Mayor has very limited powers over existing buildings of what he can do. And so that's one of the areas where we really need to see some change. We need some devolution of powers down to the Mayor around existing buildings. One of the issues that have been talked about is TfL. TfL are London's largest landowner. And I remember doing a piece of work for Greenpeace in 2015, which led to the development of the Mayor's London Solar Action Plan. At that time, in 2015, when support mechanisms for solar were very generous, TfL only had one solar project of around about 200 kilowatts. Roll on, 7 years now or so since 2015, getting data from TfL is extremely challenging But the last mayoral question I saw, which was actually, I think, asked by Assembly Member Cooper, was around about 6 months ago, and they'd managed to triple their amount of capacity from 200 kilowatts to 600 kilowatts. This is a major organisation, critical for London, the largest landowner, and it's only got 600 kilowatts. And to put that in context, one of the groups I work with under Community Energy London, they installed a 300 kilowatt array in a school in Brent only 2 weeks ago. So TfL really aren't pulling their weight in terms of what they can do. They have undertaken many surveys in terms of their land, and they have over 1,000 buildings. But as far as I'm aware, I've not seen an awful lot of capacity. So the first thing is having some ability over London's existing buildings. The second thing is for TfL really to pull its weight in terms of what it can do on the land it owns. I'll stop there for the moment, if that's okay, Tony.
Thank you very much. You took the words out of my mouth, actually, and perhaps maybe, Chair, that we could write to the top people in the GLA families, be it the new commissioner, be it Andy Byford, and maybe we could even get Andy Byford on the board of one of Saeed's excellent organisations. So unless we've got senior management engaged in this, it's all going to be talk. But if somebody of that level gets involved, I'm sure we could accelerate things, Chair.
Thank you very much, Tony. Saeed, I see you've got a hand up, but I think that's a historic hand, right?
It is, but can I just want to mention one very quick thing that Tony mentioned, which was taking that acronym DNO for Distribution Network Operator. Just to say, the distribution network operators, the biggest one in London is UK Power Network, so who I'm sure many of you are aware of. They have to go through a process every 5 years with the regulator Ofgem, because they're a monopoly operator. They have to agree their next 5 years business plan. We are right at the cutting edge of that 5-year agreement in the next few months. So if the mayor or the committee or anybody else want UK Power Networks to do more on connecting renewable supply in London, or more in terms of better connections to new developments, as Tony mentioned in West London, now is the time, because they are agreeing that business plan for Ofgem for the next 5 years. In total, across the distribution network operators, that's £22 billion worth of investment over the next 5 years. So London would probably make a good £5 to £6 billion of that in total. That's the amount of investment that will be going in over the London and South East region. But they have to have an agreement with Ofgem on what their business plan is. And the consultation by Ofgem was issued around about 10 days ago. Thanks.
Chair, could I suggest perhaps if Saeed could almost draft something for us, we could write to Basil Scarlaley, who is the Chief Executive of UK Power Networks, who I know, who's one of my residents and it's a local business, and maybe the committee could write, with the exam question, how you can accelerate this.
If Saeed's happy to do that, then I think that's a good idea. I'm going to put the caveat in there, obviously with group lead permission and everyone agreeing with it, etc. Saeed, is that something you'd be happy to do? I feel like you're very on the spot here.
Yeah, well, happy is not exactly the right word I'd use, but I'll rise to Tony's challenge and I'll see what I can do. I mean, one thing I will say just very, very quickly, I was looking through the statistics of their modelling, and they show vast amounts of renewable energy coming in over their business area over to the period of 2050. But London is incredibly low in terms of their numbers. I would challenge that number, and I'll tease that out in the note that I prepared for the committee, and you can dwell upon that before you send any kind of a letter off to Basil. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I've got hands from Assembly Member Cooper and Catherine. If we can go to Assembly Member Cooper first of all.
Thanks, Zach. I just wanted to ask two things, and both to Saeed, I think. We were talking about the massive scaling up that we need, and you were talking particularly about TfL. I just wondered if there are any areas which are causing blockages and are slowing down the growth, for example, in terms of the installation of PV panels on roofs or any other kind of renewables. Do we have enough skilled people to actually support the industry? Because I was involved just before the 2012 change in the feed-in tariff regulations, with putting together some big schemes with housing associations and other landowners, and there were a lot of companies that sprang up that all sort of died away, that it all went through the MCS accreditation. So where are we in terms of looking beyond the community energy sector? Do we have enough skilled people who can do those kind of installs? And I also just wanted to ask you, you mentioned the feed-in tariff, which obviously was slashed in 2012. It was delayed slightly after a judicial review, but then it was always originally meant to decline, but it sort of fell off a cliff. It was a government decision. I installed my own panels before that. Do you think a higher feed-in tariff would revitalise individual solar installations? And I ask that with particular reference, obviously, to the cost of living crisis that we find ourselves in. My bills, of course, are much smaller than they would be if I didn't have my panels. So, you know, I wouldn't say I'm sitting pretty, because like everyone else, my bills will still go up, but I'm starting from a much lower base. Thanks, Chair.
I'll jump in, and there's one thing I'll pass to Catherine as well. So just to mention on the skills bit, the Mayor's launched a really excellent initiative with solar skills for London. So Catherine and Chet may want to provide with further information on that, but that's a really fantastic initiative by the Mayor. I've not seen any other region really pick up on something like that, so that's really good. On the slowing down on PV, well, you're in a better position, I think, as a committee to try and tease out that answer from TfL than I am. I'd just say the first reference to TfL undertaking a power purchase agreement for solar was in around about 2007. So we've seen it taken about 15 years to get to that position where they've actually issued that call to the market for a PPA. And calls upon solar on TfL land have gone on for quite some time, and we've just seen really, really slow activity. So I'm really not sure why they've been so slow in taking advantage. It must be remembered, in the 70s and 80s, TfL used to run 5 power stations. They were an electricity generator, and slowly they closed down all their power stations and retired them and decided to buy their power from the market. The only one that they still have some ownership over is Greenwich Power Station. This is not new for TfL. This is what they were doing for many decades before they walked away from the power market. Their bills are only going up and their electricity demand is only going up. And just very quickly on your last point, I think, Leonie, we're beyond subsidies now for solar. So in many respects, the subsidies that we've seen have been regressive to an element, because people can afford solar, put it on their homes, but the costs associated to solar are spread across every energy user. So the one thing I will say is I was at a Solar Energy UK meeting last week, and they mentioned that the market is bouncing back quite healthily. And the really positive thing is that solar rooftop capacity is increasing at pace, which I need to kind of delve into more. Why is that the case? So that's really positive for London, and we really need to capture on that in the coming years. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Said.
Thank you very much. I've got a hand from Catherine, and I'm going to come to Assembly Member Bokhari to finish this section. Catherine.
Thank you. Just to say that our Deputy Mayor for the Environment is meeting with Commissioner Andy Byford later this month, and we'd be happy to raise the question about TfL's installations of solar on its land or otherwise. You're right that they are now over a 600 kilowatt peak across now more than 10 sites, but that is behind the Metropolitan Police Service, and it's behind London Fire Brigade, which now has solar PV on more than half of its buildings. So there is more that could be done. I think I would say perhaps in TfL's defence that the PPA, the power purchase agreement that they've just launched the procurement for, will provide renewable energy at least 100 times bigger in scale than those individual installations of solar across their own estate. So in terms of decarbonising their own power consumption, the PPA is the most efficient way to go, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't push on all fronts.
Thank you very much. I do know London Fire Brigade took a big jump in the last few years. Not that it's a competition, but if there was a league table, then we've got some catching up to do. Assembly Member Bokhari.
I just want from Catherine a little bit of clarity on the Mayor's position on nuclear energy. If she can just fill me in with that, please.
The Mayor's position is that he prioritises renewable energy. He sees that as the most sustainable, cleanest, greenest, and also most flexible and quickly deployed way to achieve net zero.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to the next section, which is the role of GLA Group and London Power. And this is back to Assemblymember Bukhari.
You have touched on a couple of issues already that I'm going to be talking about, but I want to talk firstly about City Hall itself, the new City Hall. And in July 2021, the Mayor of London actually said that it would be powered by 100% renewable energy sources before the staff moved in. Catherine and Chetan, can we have a little bit of feedback about that? So let's go to Chet first. Did it happen before?
I'd have to look at that, and I know that sort of at the moment through our current energy tariff, we've got 100% renewable electricity at City Hall. There's no gas, so it's all electrically heated, and then we're looking at through the GLA group doing PPAs for the future, which would be more, but we can check on that.
So you don't know if it is 100% renewable
no,
energy yet?
It's 100% renewable. I think it's your question in terms of was it on
when
before
yeah.
before staff moved in? So I'd have to check on that.
Okay, but currently it is now, everything is 100%. Yeah. And when did that happen exactly? You don't know?
I'd have to check the exact date. I don't have that to hand.
Okay, all right. So you'll let the committee know in writing, I hope. Yeah. Fantastic. Within that answer, will you be able to tell us a little bit about, why there were possible delays? What were the issues there? Is that possible for you to do as well, Chair?
I can look that up. It might all be just through the sort of the boring minutiae of contracts and all that kind of stuff. So I'll go and find that out.
Thank you so much. So I will move a little bit. You have already talked about TfL, the GLA group estate itself, and what's been discussed already by our guests is that TfL are a little bit behind the London Fire Brigade and the Met. So can we talk a little bit more about the new solar panels and the plans and the targets, specifically the targets for the next few years? So Catherine, can I ask that question for you? What's the plan? What have you got ahead for the next few years to make sure that we are up to speed?
Thank you. Could I just check, Assembly Member, whether you're referring to the GLA's own internal targets or the GLA group or wider London targets?
This specific question is about the GLA group.
Okay, certainly. So at the moment, we're engaging with all of the functional bodies to ask them to produce their net zero plans of how they can get their own energy and carbon footprint to net zero by 2030, in line with the Mayor's targets for London. The Mayor thinks it's really important that we lead by example. If we can't do it ourselves, then it will be hard for us to persuade others to do so. That has meant that each of the functional bodies has been reviewing their estate and also their fleet and coming back to the GLA to explain where their energy consumption currently comes from and where their carbon footprint comes from and how they can reduce that. I think there have been other conversations with committees about the climate budgeting process that is starting up this year, and that's when we bring together that carbon analysis with the financial analysis of how much each functional body is allocated for the next year and ahead. And the functional bodies will have an opportunity to make the case to the Mayor to say, well, you're asking us to do this really quite difficult thing on net zero. We know in theory how we can do it, what the technologies are. Solar is proven, moving to electric vehicles for the standard fleet is proven, but still that will have some investment costs, and how do we achieve that? So that's an ongoing conversation about both the budget and about the green bond, the £500 million that the Mayor has offered to raise. So we don't have year by year targets, but what we are asking is for each of the bodies to say, what is the trajectory between now and 2030 if they had the money to do it? And then we're talking about how we manage to finance that as quickly as possible.
I mean, we mentioned the LFB doing quite well in this particular area. Is there a reason for that?
I have to say that I don't know their estate that well in terms of the building stock, and that may be part of it. But obviously, they've also just invested their own time and efforts into identifying the sites, entering into the contracts, getting the planning permission, and so forth.
So, is it a possibility of leadership within each part of the group? That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah,
You think that might be the case?
Yes, I don't know if Syed or Chet happen to.
I can see Syed nodding his head. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to mention, I do remember this. I'm glad you remind me about this, Assembly Member Bakari. But what happened was that the Fire Brigade get money from insurance company for checking people's homes for a smoke alarm. They got a large slug of money, something like 10 years ago, and they then decided what they should do with this money. And they thought they took a very good a challenge to try and decarbonize their fire stations. And therefore, as a consequence of that, they undertook surveys of the run. I think at the time there were about 100 fire stations. There are less now. But then they took surveys and they installed everything from micro CHPs to solar and to storage as well on many of those sites. So it is absolutely about leadership. They identified a parcel of money. They undertook the survey and they went through a very comprehensive plan to actually undertake the installation. And that's, I think, sadly missing, unfortunately, from our colleagues at TfL. So that's why the LFB did so well in terms of introducing those technologies on those sites.
It does sound like there might be in need of some sharing of good practice, Catherine. Do you think that's something that you could take as part of your role?
Yes, I'm happy to say that on a monthly basis, we sit down with the officers who are responsible for energy and carbon and sustainability from across the functional bodies, both at working level, and then we bring it together in a meeting chaired by the Deputy Mayor to review their progress, particularly on these net zero plans. But the Mayor is asking very, very keenly what progress is being made this year, as well as their grander plans for the next decade.
So let's move on to Syed. How should the Mayor be utilising more of his assets? You've touched on this already yourself, but just if you can extend on your thoughts and the resources to increase the supply of renewable energy in London.
Absolutely. Okay, that was a great question. Just one quick thing I wanted to mention just on targets, just very quickly, is that we are in a major period of flux for the electricity market, not only because of the way in which energy prices have just gone sky high, and that changes the internal rate of return for the investment cases for solar. So there is never a better case for solar at the moment, and that's why the functional bodies need to look at it. And just to say, the British Energy Security Supply Strategy, which was published by the Prime Minister back in March or April, that actually had a commitment to quintuple the present level of solar in the UK. So at the moment, we have 13 gigawatts, 13,000 megawatts of solar in the UK installed. Quintupling will take you that to nearly 70 gigawatts. That is a huge amount of solar capacity, and therefore, basically all the public sector and everybody else needs to rise to that challenge to look to see how much solar. At the moment, the Mayor, I think there's a 1.5 gigawatt solar target for London. And the target for TfL is fairly modest at 1 megawatt, which after 5 years, they still haven't achieved as yet. So I think that all needs to be looked at with a little bit more ambition, I would say.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, that's very useful to know. And yes, we were talking about the utilising more of his assets. Could you want to talk a little bit more about that side?
Yeah, so I think looking at the full range of the Mayor's powers, we've mentioned TfL and obviously the other functional bodies, that other areas where I think there's been some good examples of where energy's played a major role is through the opportunity areas. So we've seen obviously work going on earlier on through the Olympic site and through the Isle of Dogs, where they're looking at things like heat networks. But we have a number of other opportunity areas. I think there are 30 in total in London where work's been undertaken, including existing energy strategies. So one of the things I think the committee might want to look to is how is that work across opportunity areas in terms of energy strategies being developed? How is that work looking not only across that opportunity area, but a key thing is beyond the red line of opportunity area. For instance, Old Oakham Park Royal is one of the largest regeneration sites planned in the whole of Europe. it's been quite slow on a number of areas, but on energy, one of the things when I went to meetings with them around about 4 or 5 years ago is not wanting to have this exemplar area with fantastic, new technology, but also outside of the red line for those neighborhoods around it, how can they reach out and help develop those areas as well? So it's being a bit more imaginative about how you look at new development in London and not only isolate those renewable technologies to those new buildings, but how do you go outside of that? And so just one example is the main new science centre that's been built just behind the British Library. His name just evades me at the moment, it'll come back to me. Within the planning requirements, they have to look to the heat networks to Somerstown in Euston, opposite the actual centre. So is that creative way of the mayor and boroughs looking to utilise the massive investment going in these new developments to see what can you do beyond the red line? And
Yeah,
there
I'm
are
really
ample opportunities across all of London to do that.
You've actually taken my next question, because that's what I wanted to know. Is there evidence to show that the mayor is actually influencing these new developments? And is that one example? Are there others that this is actually happening across London? Would be quite interesting to know. Have you noticed anything more than that, Saeed, or is this something that we need to look into further?
That's a really good question. The mayor does produce an annual report on energy and planning policies. So the last one came out in March 2021, and the next one I believe is coming out in autumn. So that's a review of how the London Plan energy policies have had an impact on new development. And I think they cover that issue within that report. But I can certainly look at the last couple of reports and feedback to you on that.
That would be great. Thank you so much. That was really useful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I think you're talking about Francis Crick's side. Yeah, brilliant. I saw Assembly Member Devonish and Catherine put their hands up, and I saw you took them down again. I don't know if Catherine, you still want to speak, and I'll come to Assembly Member Devonish in case it's another question. Catherine.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly on the Old Oak Park Royal Development Corporation, just to say that that was something where the Green New Deal Fund gave £1 million towards 4 projects supporting greater deployment of solar power in London, and the OPD was part of that. So again, an interesting example for rolling out solar across the roofs of industrial estates, and one of our ambitions is to take that what's done in West London and then to learn from that and help to deploy solar PV across similar sites across the capital. I was going to say I think there was sorry, I've forgotten the last question that came up just now that was discussed. I'll pass on.
It was about new developments.
Oh, on new developments, yes, thank you very much. Just to say that the London Plan does encourage require applicants to go through the energy hierarchy, which looks at all of the on-site measures that they can take to decarbonise. They're expected to decarbonise to the maximum amount on-site before then looking at offsets elsewhere. And since 2016, of all of the applications that have been referred to the mayor, there's been 36 megawatts of new solar PV capacity installed. So we believe that the plan is having that encouraging influence on developers.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Devonish.
I was just going to ask if Catherine and Saeed have been to see David Luntz, who obviously runs Old Oak recently, and bearing in mind it's the summer, it's a great time to go out and see people post-COVID and press. And if you've got a P&L business case, I'm sure David would love to put loads of PV across Old Oak.
I haven't been David, but I did have a similar conversation like that, Tony, about 6 years ago. But I think I was a bit too early in what I was proposing, and they didn't quite get it. But and just to add one thing, it would be really helpful as part of this discussion, and just to reflect upon, is it's not only put about solar capacity or other renewables in London, it's how it works in the most efficient way. And so I'll just leave you with the thought, it's not only about the renewable capacity, low carbon, net zero capacity, but it's having a smarter energy network and how we utilize that power. Every kilowatt hour generated in London has to be used in the most efficient way possible. So we need storage, we need flexibility, we need better customer awareness of when to use their technology. So that's part and parcel of making sure that London can be net zero, not in each kilowatt hour generated, but using it in the best way possible.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are around the GLA Group's power purchase agreements, which Catherine, you touched on a little earlier. But my first question is for Chetan, please, if I can. And that's the GLA Group's Memorandum of Understanding states that it will achieve 50% of its electricity demand from renewable energy sources by 2030. And I'm just wondering, do you have any milestones for this? For example, what will the figure be for next year in 2026, which is the halfway point? Have you got any targets set out? You're on mute.
Thank you. There's a couple of things on unpacking that. So I think we're aiming for at least 50% of annual energy usage through PPAs, sort of eventually and potentially more. In terms of how that's going to work over the next few years and the timelines, the TfL's first sort of PPA was launched last month, or sort of went into the market last month. That's for like 10 to 12% of power. That procurement process will take probably about 12 to 13 months. So we hope that the contract for that will be awarded in July next year. And then, then after that, we've got what we've established as this, as you said, this memorandum of understanding. We've got an energy collaboration program to enable all the other members of the GLA group to take part in the future PPA procurements. What we can't have is have two procurements in the market at the same time, because that might distort the market. So, so the next procurement we're looking to launch as soon as the first one's tendered. So if we get the 10 to 12% of the GLA, of the TfL's sort of demand for a PPA into the market for by July next year. Shortly after that, so next summer, then we can launch the next phase, which will include sort of GLA, MPS, Fire Brigade, as well as TfL. At the moment, we're not putting down sort of firm guidelines of how much we're going to procure. We're just going to see what the market looks like at the time. So, depending on sort of how the market's recovered, we'll try and secure the optimum size of tranche.
Can I ask? I mean, the chair hinted at it earlier about the volatility of the market at the moment for a variety of reasons, including the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Has that made this latest tranche, has it made it riskier, I suppose, that you might be tied into higher prices than you would otherwise have acquired?
So in terms of what we've asked the market to provide, we're not asking for energy from existing generation. We're asking for it to come from new build, or PPAs from new build facilities. So in theory, that should be less sensitive to current market conditions. As the price is determined more by the price of building the wind farm rather than what the market says. However, I guess the price you pay will be a bit influenced by what the market feels that the future price is going to be. But so what we'll do is continue to watch the market as each tranche progresses to make sure that we get the best value for London.
Thank you. I was a bit worried when you're early on in your answer to me, you said that you'd get there eventually, and the target is 2030. Are you still sure you can make that 2030 target?
No, but by that I mean we'll get there by 2030. Okay. I guess the pace in terms of how if we can get there soon, if the market is right and we can get away bigger tranches earlier, I'm sure we'd like to do earlier.
Okay, thank you.
But I think we are kind of bound by sort of what we can get in the market.
Good. And can I ask, because obviously the GLA group, for example, TfL, will be bound into existing energy contracts. So are the future tranches dependent on when those existing contracts come to an end, or can this, if you like, can you control when you put them out?
It's all wrapped up in when contracts end, which is partly a reason why sort of TfLs are able to go quicker. I'd have to check up on the exact end dates of all of our contracts across the group, but I don't think that's going to be too much of an issue if you're looking at going to the market next year, and if it takes a year to procure, then and sort of a bit longer for installations to actually be built. If you're looking at 24, 25, that shouldn't be a problem by that point.
Thank you. And can I also ask you, of the 4 planned PPA procurement tranches, how many do you think the GLA itself will participate in?
So the GLA's energy load is quite a lot lower than everyone else in the group. So we want decarbonisation of our own actions to meet the mayor's net zero targets, and if we're not walking the walk, how can we expect others to do that? So we already have 100% renewable electricity through our current supply, and we're driving this collaboration program through the other functional bodies to support the group. So we will be involved in this program. We're driving it, and then we'll decide whether to pass to enter into each tranche based on the market data at the time. But I guess we intend to be involved. We're really driving the process ourselves.
Thank you, that's helpful. And Catherine, I just have a couple of questions for you, if I can. One is, I suppose, with regards to TfL, how does the GLA hold TfL accountable for its commitment to supply 100% of its electricity by renewable sources by 2030? You've talked about monthly meetings.
Yeah, sure. So the GLA coordinates the collaborative group procurement programme that Chet's spoken about. We chair the steering committee for the programme. We're updated on progress on a monthly basis. So we're very closely involved with that. TfL have taken the lead in launching the first PPA, so they're ahead of the rest of the group, and we're learning from them. But as we get into the collaborative procurement, that's something that the GLA steers.
Okay, that's helpful. So, and those meetings, those discussions, they are not just updates, I take it, it's challenging as well.
Of course.
Thank you. And then my final question is, will the GLA Green Bonds Programme fund the PPAs in any way? Is that something you're looking at?
So the GLA Treasury is developing a finance facility which can be used for developers who are bidding for either the TfL or GLA group PPAs, for those developers to finance their projects. But that is separate from the Green Bonds Programme, so it's just targeted at the PPA. Developers, when they bid, don't have to use that finance. It's entirely optional, and it won't affect how they're scored in the procurement process. But we do hope that the availability of that finance will reduce the cost of finance for developers, and it will mean that we get more competitive bids, and therefore a lower price eventually for the TfL or for the GLA group as it procures.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you, and morning everyone. Chetan, just starting with you if that's okay, and moving on to London Power. Deputy Mayor has referred to stopping quarterly reports and a move to minimise overhead costs within the London Power team. Could you let us know some of the specific changes that have been made to London Power's expenditure since March 2022?
Yeah, of course, Emma. So the deputy mayor wrote to the chair in March to say, to update on the state of the energy market. So because there's no switching going on at the moment, and customers are a bit better off not switching. We said that try and get best value for Londoners, we're trying to minimise our overhead costs. So since then, we've reduced sort of the GLA staff allocation to London Power by about 50%. What we've done sort of in doing that, we've split some of the activities that we do across a few different staff members. So, you know, we still have the right skill set on London Power, and we've got the right knowledge in the team to scale up if, you know, when the market recovers. And then the rest of the team time has temporarily been sort of moved on to other projects within the environment and energy team, including sort of work on our response to the cost of living challenge. In terms of, you know, what we continue doing, we'll make sure that all regulatory and contractual arrangements are fulfilled, but we're not doing some of the non-essential activities. So, you know, some of the activities that were being done by the team in the past was around customer acquisition, stakeholder engagement with boroughs and housing associations, and some of the reporting. So we're trying to reduce some of that. And you know, that means we expect to operate at no net cost to Londoners in 2023, and our costs are covered by sort of the money that comes in through commission. Say that only impacts GLA resource, the customer service resource that Octopus Energy are providing to the London Power team remains unchanged. So London Power customers shouldn't see any difference to the excellent customer service that they get.
Thanks. So just to confirm, so the staff have been reallocated basically to other projects within the GLA. How many staff are currently within the like working on the London Power team?
So we've got little bits of different people. So there's a little bit of me, for example, but I've been spending sort of more time looking after the energy team in recent months as well. There's a little bit of analytical support. There's sort of a little bit of sort of engagement support. So
how many people are working full time then on London Power?
So as a full-time equivalent over the year, it would be about, you know, sort of roughly one person, but it's bits of people's roles.
Okay, so the customer service team, for example, is
so that's unchanged. The customer service team sort of sits within Octopus Energy. So sort of that, what I'm talking about is sort of GLA staff and GLA resources in terms of you know, GLA time was spent on managing the contract with the partner, sort of on engaging with boroughs. So that's the sort of activity that we're doing less of. But in terms of like core customer service, that's been unchanged at Octopus.
Okay, and what's the funding arrangement there?
For which part, sorry?
The funding arrangement at Octopus Energy, is that just, are they working through that, say that customer service team, for example, now, is that just working through commission, or what's the
Oh no, so because we operate as a white label, sort of Octopus Energy, you know, sort of look after all the, you know, they take all the commercial risk on London Power, but they also do all the customer service, sort of, you know, within the margin that they make.
Okay.
But I mean, the customer service has always been separate from, you know, so from the costs that the GLA have incurred on London Power.
Okay. So what is the total cost of London Power to the GLA to date?
So in terms of how the finance of London Power have worked, the total setup costs have been 2.3 million, and that was made up. So yeah, and that's over. You know, that's from when the project started in, I think, going back three or 4 years. So there was around 1.2 million pounds on procurement and setup costs, and then about 1.1 million was spent on covering company mobilisation. So setting up the company in the first place, sort of some of the work done on setting up the brand, and then on the launch, sort of marketing and engagement costs. And then on top of that, London Power's running costs have been funded by a GLA loan. We're intending for them to be covered by commission, but until the customer base grew to become large enough for the commission to cover and exceed the cost, there's a loan in place with a maximum value of 906,000. So at the end of financial year 21-22, so sort of at 31st of March, so in our books that will show us being around 159,000.
Sorry, at the end of this year it'll be 159,000.
Yeah.
And how much income is GLA expected to receive from London Power this financial year?
So I guess, you know, given this the status of the market, so we're not expecting much customer acquisition. So it's hard to know sort of what we'll get from customer acquisition. We've got two sources of income, sort of I guess acquisition commission and retention commission. So you know, given you know, we don't. It's hard to understand when the market will sort of reopen again. It's hard to say. You know, we're aiming to keep our costs lower than income from retention commission whilst the market's close to switching to try and keep to a net neutral financial position.
In the Mayor's budget, it seems to suggest that £246,000 will come in as income.
As income? I think that might have been what we had as so I think that was a view of a mixture of commission and loan. So we have sort of reduced our expected costs to be a lot lower than that. And you know, I think we should be able to say, well, it's hard to say sort of what we expect for the year going ahead. We expect to sort of announce what the costs and income were for last year, for the year ending 21-22 in our in the London Power annual review sort of soon. So we'll be able to share that with you.
Yeah, it is quite clear. The draft budget for 22-23 notes that London Power will provide £246,000 of income for the GLA.
Look, can I get back to you on sort of the basis of that? I think that's, you know, sort of rather than expected income in terms of commission, that might have been sort of a view of expected costs, and you know, we'd look to match that with income from commission plus sort of the sort of money from the loan if it was required. But you know, what we're seeking to do is reduce the costs of London Power from GLA from GLA resources to ensure that we're not asking for money from taxpayers.
Yeah, I think that would be great if we could stop doing that. But I think, can we get some clarity really urgently on that, because that's a bit of a mess then, those figures.
I think Catherine wanted to come in.
Yes, yeah, I'm happy to look into that and break that down. As Chet says, I think that is a mixture of the loan and then the income that we make through the commission. But it's worth just bearing in mind that budget will have been set before we knew about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Certainly when I joined the GLA at the end of 2021, we were discussing the relaunch of the marketing and the customer acquisition programme for London Power. And we were all set to do that this spring after 2 years of COVID, in which we'd not been able to do that because of the volatility in the market. So I think it would have been a reasonable forecast to make or scenario at the point of making the budget at the end of last year and the very start of this year, that we would see some income from customer acquisition. Then of course we know what has happened in the last few months, and we sadly haven't been able to launch that marketing campaign as we would have wanted to.
I think we've known for quite a while that we weren't doing this marketing campaign before the budget, if my memory serves me right, because I believe me and Assemblymember Cooper were discussing this with the Mayor back in the back end of 2021. And we were already saying then that there was not going to be any income. So I don't know how this figure came about. It seems to me after the fact that conversation had already arisen. But it was interesting that Chetan, you said today that London Power will break even by 2023. So that was interesting to hear, at least. Just one final question that I had was the customer network of 6,400. So you know when launched in 2019, at this point, how many customers you had assumed would be under London Power? And I asked that question, obviously, knowing everything that's happened in the market since then, but I would like to get a steer on where you thought we would be at this point when this launched.
So I think we haven't, we didn't have forecasts in that way. So we'd hope that we'd have a lot of Londoners come and join us with our fantastic offer. What we have seen is in terms of the timing of launching London Power. Sort of 6 weeks after we launched, we went into the first lockdown for the pandemic. We had to stop our marketing, and then sort of in 2021 we've had energy sort of crisis, had 30 suppliers fail, and then this year the invasion of Ukraine sent energy prices even higher. So we've just not been able to acquire as we'd have hoped to.
I understand. I don't think we need to rehash that. I think we all understand but what I'm saying is, when you were starting in 2019, where was the ambition? Was it 100,000 customers? Was it 10,000 customers? Was it 1 million customers? The ballpark of everyone must, when you start a venture like this, you would have a ballpark somewhere where you would, even if you didn't have a specific forecast, which I think in itself is a bit bizarre, but you would still have a ballpark of where you thought you would be.
So I'd have to come back to you on that in terms of sort of what we can sort of what we've said in the past and what we can say.
Catherine, would you have any idea where you thought we would be?
So no, this was well before my time, and I'm afraid I don't know what those original expectations or assumptions were. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Shall I pass back to you? But I'd say that with all the respect to Catherine and Chetan, over the past 2 sessions, I felt like there's quite a few questions where we're just not clear, or we're having to get information back where I kind of assumed that we would have that information. And I did say that with the most respect, but I think it stops us kind of exploring these areas in the committee.
Yeah, thank you, Assemblymember Best. I don't know if it's for heat, Chetan, but I'm very confused by the section we've just had with the numbers. I heard kind of a light commitment to write to us and give clarity on that. Can I push you for kind of a stronger commitment that, say, within the month, you'll get back to us with more specific numbers so we can scrutinise effectively as a committee? Because it felt like all of that was a bit mushy, and I understand it's complicated, but it's very hard to scrutinise unless we have the data.
On which points was?
Well, I would say on everything really, in terms of on London Power, in terms of the expected income, where we're at now, the amount of staff that there are part-time. So in other words, all the questions that Assemblymember Best had just asked, I felt like, and I'm saying this as a neutral chair, and I think this is fair to you as well, because I'm sure that you want the accurate data. So we're scrutinising things that are accurate rather than assumptions that we might make. But would it be possible to write to us with a transparent and open process so we can scrutinise those numbers and ask the appropriate questions?
Yeah, Chet, I think we can clearly write with more explanation about those assumptions that went into the budget for that £246,000. You and I have both given our understanding of it, but we can confirm that. And in terms of the full-term equivalents, we can also give the exact number for that. Thanks.
At the risk of Paxmaning you, which I'm generally not intending to do, as well as assumptions, can I check that the actual data will be in there too? Because I think that's what we really need here is the numbers as opposed to the narrative.
Yes, I think we'll have to check with Octopus about which parts of the data is commercially sensitive, which isn't, but we'll provide as much as we can. I think it is worth saying, I appreciate the questions about the big picture about London Power, that they're natural questions to ask, but what we have been trying to do this year is to make sure that we have a net neutral impact on the London taxpayer. So that's really important for us. It's something we believe we're going to achieve by reducing the amount of GLA staff time that is spent on managing this contract and using it on other topics which are also really important for Londoners: cost of living crisis, fuel poverty, etc. So this year we expect to come in under budget, and so we hope that is in itself welcome.
That's absolutely welcome, and I can't speak for the whole committee, but I think I can, from the questions, that we've all got the same intentions here, and we're glad to see things potentially getting better. But it is important that we have those numbers, so we're going from the actual data. I'm going to come to Assemblyman Cooper in a second. Can I just check in with you, Syed, here, really about the whole market and what needs to be changed to help support renewable energy?
That's a small question, Chair. One key element actually is this: when you have, again, just focusing on solar, when you have excess power to your site's requirements, that power spills onto the grid. And I would argue that if you have solar in the middle of London, that power then will go to the nearest user, and it's a very valuable unit of power because you're avoiding a unit of power from coming down the transmission distribution network else into London. So every unit of power that's generated in London, which is close to the site of the user, is a valuable commodity and should be valued such. At the moment in time, the government issued a policy around about 3 years ago called the Smart Export Guarantee. And we've seen power prices, as we've discussed several times during this committee, skyrocketing upwards. However, renewable generators, especially on solar, especially in smaller sites, like the community energy groups that we'll be talking about shortly, they're not getting a fair price for the power that they're exporting off-site. So what we need is greater transparency over these smart export guarantees, and we need government to be really pushing suppliers to make sure that smaller generators, those ones that are typical in urban areas, get the full value of the electricity that they generate and export. That's not happening at the moment, and that's really critical for the growth of solar within London in the future.
Thank you. I have lots of follow-up questions, but they all take us into community energy, which I won't do that, but maybe that's an indicator of where we should be going. Assemblyman Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to, I think it might be worth if we ask the scrutiny officers or the committee clerks if they look at the transcript or some of the previous meetings between 2016 and 21. I'm fairly sure we were given projections then as a committee, as the Environment Committee, as to where the plan was for London Power customer numbers to be. So we have had that answer in the past, which might be helpful for us to also look at that, to look back on. But my other question, we've sort of alluded to the fact that we work with Octopus Energy on this white label basis. And I just wondered if either Chet or Catherine could just, for the benefit of people listening who don't know what white label means, if they could just unpack that. But also, and more particularly, could they also say, if we hadn't gone forward on a white label basis, where do they think London Power would be now? Would it be in the same place as Robin Hood Energy and Bristol Energy, i.e. completely non-functioning? Has doing the white label link up with Octopus saved London Power at this point? And I don't mind which of them answers that question.
So I'm happy to take that one on. So in terms of what does a white label mean, I guess there would have been two ways to to enter the energy market. One would have been to become a fully licensed supplier ourselves, and the second way would be to do what we ended up doing, which is to enter into a white label partnership with an existing fully licensed supplier. So as with that, Octopus takes on a lot of the sort of functions of the supply. So they buy the energy, they take all the commercial risks, they provide all the customer service, they provide the billing engine, all that kind of thing. If we'd gone down the fully licensed sort of route ourselves, and we'd have had to spend years getting a license, taking on sort of that kind of commercial risk, building customer service team, building a billing engine, all that kind of stuff. So Octopus takes care of all of that for us for London Power in a kind of a London Power brand, and then our role is to sort of drive customers towards that. So through using Merrill and Borough channels. If we had gone down a fully licensed route, it's hard to say what would have happened, but if you look at some of the other examples, so Nottingham went down that route with Robin Hood Energy, Bristol went down that route with Bristol Energy, and both failed over the last couple of years, and both ended up costing their local authorities around £40 million. So I think in hindsight, we were right to take the white label route.
Thanks. There was quite a lot of pressure at the time that we should have gone it on a completely, independent basis, and I'm very glad that we didn't follow that route, despite the pleas from, particularly the Green Party Assembly members at that time, because I think that saved us £40 million of abortive costs. Thank you, Chair. Chair, you are now on mute. It's my turn.
Thank you. Yeah, I was struggling for it. I won't take the bait on that one. I will move us on. I think we're going to solar panel section, or solar section, which seems appropriate for today. And I'm back to you, Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you. I'm glad you didn't take the bait on that one, but it is perfectly true that is what the Green Party was arguing very strongly. I thought it was quite risky, and if at some point in the future it becomes appropriate, I'm sure we might move to that, but currently I think it would be a very difficult and challenging arrangement. I think we've probably covered off some of the areas, but Saeed, the first question that I was going to ask you is about the specific challenges in London to increasing the supply of solar. You've talked a lot about that. Is there anything else that you'd like to add at this point at all to your previous remarks?
Let's go through the kind of customers. So thanks, Leni. So first of all, in terms of individual householders, the Mayor's Solar Together scheme appears to be working quite well. It'd be good to see more data on that as the projects roll out across London. But anecdotally, from what I've seen, that's working terrifically well, and it really shows the demand there for solar from households. From speaking to the trade association, I'm aware that companies are being inundated in terms of requests for solar. They didn't locate that geographically specifically to London. I will go back and ask them, but as far as I'm aware, across the country, there's huge demand for solar because we're seeing such incredible high increases in electricity. And just to remind people that the price cap that Ofgem set was at £1,200 until the beginning of this year. It then moved up to just over £2,000, and in October it's predicted to move up to £3,000. That completely changes the dynamic in terms of people's thinking. So Solar Together is really good, but there's still hassle factors in terms of really getting solar on your house. And of course, that's great if you live in a semi-detached house. What about people living in flatted accommodation? So there still seems to be more thinking that needs to be going to how can we do solar on flatted accommodation, but share the benefits of that solar array. And so some of the community energy groups are undertaking innovative projects to look at that, whereas you can put solar on the roof of a tower block or a low-rise building or flatted accommodation, but then allocate electricity from that solar panel through smart meters to individual households. It sounds like it should be a very straightforward thing, the way the electricity market is arranged, which Chet has kind of been reflecting in terms of talk about London Power and the relation with Octopus, it is quite challenging. So the hassle factor, flatted accommodation, and then just turning to SMEs, there are really no good programs out there from central government, and I'm happy to be corrected, from London government, but SMEs make up a huge backbone of London business. We need to find ways in which they can access these services as well in the best way possible. And just there was an earlier question about case studies. What's a good example? That was asked early on, forgive me, I didn't answer at the time, but for instance, in West London, a large warehouse there, I believe Hounslow's done a large 2 megawatt solar scheme back in 2018 with storage on top, which was undertaken through the Mayor's refit programme, now called the Retrofit Accelerated Workplaces. There are ample opportunities for large solar across London, and we really need to delve into the detail of why businesses not exploiting the opportunities that solar offers to them more. I'm sure as you go around, I go around in London on the top floor of a double-decker bus, you see vast amounts of roofs which are still not using solar. They're not crowded out by trees. They're not overshadowed by buildings. They're clearly buildings that there are going to be a long time, and yet they don't have solar. We must ask the question of, even with the London Solar Action Plan, we're not exploiting solar as much as we could be.
So just on the point about, thank you for that, just on the point about Solar Together, it sounds as though it's incredibly active and there's an awful lot of work going on. Do we have any idea of the sort of the scale of the installations that are going on at the moment? It sounds like the market's very active, because I'm sure like there are other assembly members on the call, and I'm sure like them, I've received a couple of complaints from people who've had delays from scaffolding being put up, and a couple of people have written to me sort of having a quick moan about it. I mean, I'm just wondering, 2 or 3 people writing to me having a moan out of roughly how many? That might be one for Catherine. I don't know whether you know the answer to that side. You were saying it seems to be going well. Do you know how many things are going up or in?
So I don't have access to the data, so Catherine could probably talk about that. All I can say is that I've actually had also anecdotal comments from people who've had it on, and they've been very happy as well. So
only one or two.
Yeah, only one or two my side as well. But hopefully Catherine can elaborate on the data. Catherine?
Any idea what sort of percentage of people complaining about delays versus lots of things going on?
Sure, yeah, I can tell you about how many installations we've had. So Solar Together is a group buying programme which allows Londoners to install solar panels on their homes at an affordable price. And what happens is that households or small businesses can register their interest in having solar PV. It could also come with battery storage and EV charging points. And the point of the group scheme is that it purchases solar panels at a competitive price on behalf of those Londoners, and then it's installed by one company that is, the Mayor has a relationship with a concessionary delivery partner, which then manages the installer directly. So we're now in our fifth phase, and in the first 4 phases, we've had over 2,000 homes that have had solar panels installed. Which is nearly 17,000 panels that have gone up on London's roofs with a 4.5 megawatt capacity. And it's been increasing in scale and ambition over time. So the first 3 phases were just under 1,000 homes were done. And then in the 4th one, we've already had over 1,000 installations. And we expect another couple of hundred to be completed by autumn. And each phase that we've run, we've seen the percentage of conversions from the original offer on paper from the company to the number of people progressing to having a survey done and then accepting the results of the survey and saying, yes, we want solar panels installed. That conversion rate has gone up. So that's been a positive sign as well, that people have liked the scheme and that they've gone ahead with it. And in phase 5, which we've done the marketing for, we put a lot of effort behind the marketing. We mailed over 800,000 London households. We've had nearly 4,000 acceptances, and even if a third or 40% of those convert, it will be the biggest phase yet. So that's the positive side of it. You're right that there have been some complaints. We take those really seriously. They've been coming not just to the installers, but some of those have been getting through to yourselves and through to us in the GLA. And that tells us that it's not working as it ought to, and we're sorry for that. And we spend a lot of time, my team and myself have spent time with iChooser, which is the delivery partner for us, who manage the installation company. And we've passed on those complaints. We've done our best to get resolutions to them. But if you hear of others, obviously we're keen to know about them.
Sure. Any idea of the sort of percentage of complaints or issues that have been passed on? I mean, I know I've passed them on because I was very concerned, but I've only had 2 or 3 in my constituency, which, given you're hopefully talking about hundreds of installations in each constituency, doesn't sound like a large number, although each one individually, obviously for that person, that's 100% of their experience being negative. So that's not good. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, we've seen a higher number of complaints on this phase, and partly because this phase is 3 times larger. But I'm afraid that it has been in the hundreds in terms of complaints that have gone to Get UK and to iChooser. The GLA hasn't received in the hundreds; it's been in the tens. But still, that's more than we would want to see. The kind of industry benchmark at which we start to get seriously focused on this is when complaints go over 10% of customers. Not that we would want 10% of people to be experiencing problems, but that's not that unusual for 1 in 10 to have something that they raise an issue about. At the moment, we have a rate of a little bit over 12% of accepted customers have raised issues with phase 4. So those are complaints that have gone to the installation or management company, not to the GLA. We've had a much smaller percentage than that. So that gives you some scale of the issues that are being faced. And I met last week with the management of iChooser. And our deputy mayor has also written to ask to meet the head of iChooser UK, just to say that this is not acceptable customer service for Londoners. We're pleased that we've done over 1,000 households in phase 4, and that we've scaled up. But we can't afford to have people lose confidence in solar, which is a proven and successful technology, just because they're not getting the customer service that they deserve.
No, it's incredibly frustrating for people if, it's like waiting for any tradesperson to come round to your house, whether it's to clean your windows or whether it's to, fix your gas boiler, staying in to wait for the scaffolders to turn up and then having 2 or 3 appointments cancelled, which was something that was brought to my attention, is unbelievably annoying and frustrating. So I'm glad I've had the opportunity to raise that generally on behalf of Londoners. More specifically, in terms of the barriers more generally across London, Assemblymember Polatsky, Chair, Emma Best has put her hand up. Assemblymember Best has put her hand up. I don't know whether you wanted to come in specifically on issues relating to solar together installs.
Just before we do, Assemblymember Best, you're welcome to ask your question. I'm just aware we've moved slightly into Assemblymember Clark's questioning that she wants to ask shortly on solar together. With that in mind, Assemblymember Best, feel free to ask your question, but just if you could self-censor yourself to either wait till after round or bring it in now if it's not stepping on the territory.
Yeah, no, I will, and it was only to back up a lot of what Leonie was saying, really. So thanks for raising that. But I think I think there's a bit more I'd perhaps like to bring in or reiterate, maybe. But I'll wait until after, so that I avoid treading on toes.
Really appreciate it. I'll bring you in after round. Back to you, Assemblymember Cooper.
Yeah, I was hoping that we could, I'm probably being a bit naughty. Maybe I should have gone into that area, so apologies to Assemblymember Clark. I've just wondered, because it seems to be an issue about installs, with having more solar installed in outer London than in inner London. We've looked at data from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy that indicates that there is more installed solar capacity in outer London. Is there a particular barrier, do you think, to having more solar installed in central London? And I can see that Chetan wants to come in at that point. Chet.
Yeah, I can take that if that's okay. So, I look at those stats as well, and we agree sort of that there's an issue, and also the boroughs as well as the sort of more installations in London in outer London boroughs. Also find the boroughs with the greatest populations of households with solar in the outer boroughs. So it's like a double whammy there. So some of the barriers that we've seen, and I think Syed has covered some of these, but we've got sort of a lot more flats in London, which are a lot harder to retrofit, especially when you've got like a home that's been split into flats. Flats also have less roof space per home as well compared to houses, so it makes it a bit more commercially difficult. There's a high proportion of private rented properties in London, and therefore landlords have less incentive to install solar, as they don't benefit from the lower energy bills. There's a lot more rented commercial buildings with this landlord split issue as well, and so I'd mentioned that sort of it's a real barrier for SMEs. You've got more conservation areas where planning is more complicated. It shouldn't be completely sort of impossible to do solar in conservation areas, but it can be a bit more challenging, a bit more expensive for householders to do. And then also, if you've got dense development, taller buildings, there's less optimal conditions for solar. You've got overshading issues. You've also got unsuitable roof spaces with a lot of sort of dormer extensions as well. So there's less places to go. So a lot of these things add up, especially in London.
So is the Mayor's Solar Action Plan currently being more successful, and is there more delivery of it in outer London rather than in inner London? And is there anything that we can do to adjust that at all?
So we've been looking at some of those barriers, especially some of the ones around sort of planning. So we sort of commissioned a report earlier on this year in terms of what are some of those sort of barriers, especially around sort of planning for solar. So we're just finishing clearing that, and then actually sort of our deputy mayor is going to meet Assembly member Sian Berry sort of about this month as well, to take her through some of the findings and pass feedback, and happy to share with the committee once that's out. So that's intended to help us and some of the partners remove some of the existing planning barriers, and therefore increase rates, and we'll share that report with all London boroughs, London councils, Historic England, national government as well. And there's a number of recommendations for the GLA, some for the national government, Historic England and London boroughs, and the kind of top level advice there is strengthening some of the permitted development rights, and then produce guidance to share some of the best practice from some of the leading boroughs, such as like Kensington, Chelsea, are doing quite a lot around conservation areas as well, and then best practice notes to help the industry in the boroughs.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Clark.
Yeah, hi. Good morning still. Chetan, just coming back to you, and we're talking a bit about people dropping out between sort of acceptance to installation in the recent rounds. Have you done any looking into why it is that people are dropping out? Because it seems like the first barrier would be making that contact in the first place. Has there been any sort of deep dives into why people are dropping out and what we could do to reduce that number?
We can look at that. We can look at that more with iChooser and the installer. I think we've found that dropout rate has decreased a bit. So in the later rounds. So I think I guess that kind of acceptance phase, customers aren't really putting down sort of a lot of sort of much money as deposit at that phase. They're just kind of they're accepting their offer, and then at that point you need to have a survey done. So there's an on-site survey which looks at sort of a detailed cost up of you know what it will actually cost at that premise and any kind of barriers, and you know that's the stage where a householder then gets their final offer, and you know perhaps that might be the first time when they see a potential invoice for sort of many thousands of pounds, and they really think, oh, is this something that I want to do? So I think that's sort of, you know, sort of where we are. We've seen sort of a lower drop off in as I said in the latest phase, and that's potentially because it's what Syed was saying earlier about you know, the energy prices going up so much that, you know, the commercials look better. So I think it's more or less around those kind of issues.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, earlier on we were having a conversation about sort of the differences between inner and outer London. I mean, my own observation is sometimes I remember the previous administration in Barnett would always cite the number of electric vehicles we had and electrical vehicle charging points, and it sometimes in outer London, I think residents are, you know, doing the right things, and it's not. It's almost by virtue of having homes, sometimes even having things that are not necessarily environmentally friendly, like drives and things that then enable residents to have electric charging points. So I think it is quite interesting when we compare inner and outer London and the ability and actually the take up of solar panel in outer London. It's interesting just because Londoners don't always have the same experience or live in the same places, how we have different outcomes, maybe just because of where people are. And but anyway, that wasn't my question. Sorry, I've just lost my notes. So here we go. I'm just wondering, Chetan, is the GLA planning any changes? I mean, so right now it feels like the world is changing around us. So by nature of that, we're getting more interest, perhaps more commitment, perhaps more uptake of solar together. But I'm just wondering, is there anything on the cards to sort of improve the uptake across London?
So in this phase, you know, I guess, you know, as Catherine said, our Solar Together program has grown year on year. So phase 4 last year was the first time we went you know, truly pan London as well, and you know, we invested in a large promotion budget to help reach more Londoners. This year has been the biggest yet. As Catherine said, we mailed over 800,000 London households, and then, you know, to increase awareness of the scheme as well as mailing out, we looked at a radio and video ads were commissioned, and they were passed to all the boroughs that were promoting the scheme through their channels. And you know, the radio advert sort of did really well. It achieved, we've been told, sort of 1.7 million impressions. So, you know, what we're looking at is sort of learning, you know, what's worked well in past schemes, past phases, and then taking that forward into future phases, in terms of you know, how we'd like to design that.
Yeah, great. Chair, I just see that Syed has his hand up, and so does Catherine. I don't know if they want to come in on the back of the comments.
Just one quick point, which is that in terms of those inner London and outer London issues and potential barriers, one thing I do remember is don't forget, the companies don't want to look for jobs that are too hard, too time consuming, too complicated. So they tend to market their actual skills, jobs, products to those areas where it's easy for them to get a quick deal. So that's one other thing in which probably Londoners, more inner London, may well be losing out. The hassle factor for the companies is also which is something which is driving to certain parts of London, because they know full well the scaffolding issue. That's why Solar Together is useful, because those companies might come into inner London when they know they haven't got one job, but they've got 50. So they're willing to overcome that hassle factor when they know they're working in a certain geographic area and they've got lots of jobs. If that doesn't happen, then they're going to stick to where it's easier wins. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's really insightful. And Catherine?
Thank you. While we were speaking, I was just eyeing the solar opportunity map that the GLA sponsored, which was published a couple of years ago. And roughly that shows more opportunities in the outer boroughs. There's plenty of opportunities across London, but you know, it may just be partly the landscape and the built environment is more conducive for all the reasons that Chet described in the outer boroughs. So well done, the outer boroughs, for pushing ahead, and we'll try and push everybody in the right direction. We also see that it makes a really big difference when the local borough is enthusiastically promoting a scheme with us. That's made a big difference for Solar Together London, so I'm sure that explains part of the variation as well. And then Assembly Member, your question was kind of what next? You know, you've got this solar action plan, but since then we've got the net zero report, and we're trying to go further and faster on all renewables, including solar. I think a couple of things to point to, that the research that we've done on planning and how the boroughs are interpreting that, you know, whether solar is permitted development essentially, or whether they're putting any restrictions or caveats on that. That research is very near to being published, and we'll be spending time with the boroughs and kind of trying to level up to create a policy environment that is nurturing of solar in London. And then the second thing that the Mayor has done, of course, is to announce the Green Bond, the £500 million that he's making available for the GLA group and for public sector strategic partners across the capital. And that can sponsor solar PV. And so that's something that we hope to be investing in as well.
Great, thank you. And I don't know, Sayed, is that a historic hand?
Just a very quick point to say that point that I think Catherine or you mentioned, Anne, about the borough's willingness to support solar is incredibly important. And so with my Community Energy London hat on, we commissioned some work last year looking at around about 24 of the climate action plans. And so I can't remember what the results were, but I'll send the link to your colleagues there, because it might be worth looking at just to see to what extent the different boroughs are promoting solar. That's one thing, but just also to say that we've not mentioned the London Council's, one of their 7 climate change packages of work is their Renewable Action Plan for London. And so that's started. They published a report in February, March this year. It's got a number of interesting working groups. It's posted on the London Council's climate change webpage. And I think that will be an important component to working with the GLA for promoting solar in the longer term.
Yeah, thanks for that. Final question, back to you, Chetan. Just wondering, getting back to the solar opportunity map, how is the GLA measuring the impact of the solar opportunity map?
For those colleagues who are unfamiliar with it, we developed it with the UCL's Energy Institute and Centre for Advanced Spatial Awareness, and it was launched in September 2020. And there's a map available on our website, so it allows you to, if you're looking to deploy PV, to understand where there's more potential, and you can really zoom into building level as well. In terms of looking at traffic to the site, we've had sort of around 6,800 page views since it was launched, and of that, it was probably sort of 2/3 in the first year, 1/3 in the past year. It's hard to say so what correlation there is between the the amount of solar installation used and that's been done as a result of people using the map. But we can see that there are people engaging with the map, using it, and it has been continued to be used over last year.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Syed. I can see you wanted to come in there.
Just to say, the London Solar Opportunity Map is, in theory, a really great tool. It's got vast amounts of work into it, huge amounts of data, but I commend Assembly members to have a look at the map and have a little think about what you'd like to see in terms of data in your neighbourhood, your street, your borough, your wards, if you're councillors. It's not very conducive for downloading data or identifying areas in where you can do meaningful things with solar. So I know from my colleagues in the community energy sector, they found it quite frustrating. If you want to look at an individual site and you know the address of the site and you can identify it on a map, then it's helpful. If you wanted to look within a location, or if you wanted to look at a type of building of London, for instance, all hospitals in London or GP surgeries or leisure centres, and you want to download that data, or all sheltered housing schemes in a particular borough, it doesn't allow you to do that. So the idea is great. The delivery and execution is a little wanting in terms of really wanting to play those tunes. For instance, if you compared it to a TfL data feed and what you can do with it on an app, we're nowhere near that. So it would be great if the GLA could take it, work with some users, find out what they'd really ideally want to use that map for, and take it to a version 2.0. Thanks.
That's an incredibly helpful nugget of information, Syed. Thank you very much. And thank you, Assembly Member Clark. As the Assembly Member who scrutinises the London Fire Brigade, I think you can say you're winning. Assembly Member Best, thank you so much for your patience, and to hand back to you. Thank you though again.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Syed, for that. I think that was a ready-made recommendation, wasn't it, there? So perfect. I wanted to come back to Solar Together quickly, if I could, and just to, I think Leonie covered the issues quite extensively, but and Catherine, you did say you were meeting, you had been taking this forward, but I wanted to know specifically can there be an action plan to get this back on track or something, because a lot of these things seem like easy fixes to me in terms of logistics. People complaining about wait times. Well, we just need to be more upfront about what the wait time is. People saying that people aren't turning up. Well, even if an appointment's cancelled, just communicating that it's quite simple. So is there any action plan in the works, or can one be formulated?
Yes, in short. So we've been putting increasing pressure on iChooser, which manages the installation company, as we've received more concerns and complaints from customers. So some of the things they've done, I mean, sorry, this is a bit specific, but as we're all interested, things like upgrading their call center software just so they have better ticketing when people call up and put in the queue, and you can see where their customer query is on the list, making sure that the prioritization system reflects if somebody has already had a scheduled appointment cancelled and then rebooked, that they prioritize customers for whom that's already been rescheduled once before, so you don't get into this situation where you've got people waiting at home 3 or 4 times and not having an installer come out to them. So they've rejigged the prioritization. They've put in place kind of clearer management oversight of some of these issues which are coming through as complaints. So there are a number of steps that Get UK have taken with the oversight of iChooser, who are also now putting one of their own staff on the Get UK site on a weekly basis for a day, just to talk to them about the performance improvements that need to be made. And usually that's something that happens monthly. They're now doing it weekly, as well as having daily phone calls about the customer progress through the from acceptance through to installation, being scheduled to it actually happening. So there's quite a lot going on. We've said to iChooser that we want to see the results from that quickly, to see that at least the number of new complaints is going down and that the existing complaints are being resolved. And that data doesn't come overnight, but we expect it to come within weeks, because otherwise we'll know that those measures aren't doing enough.
Thanks, Catherine. Can I ask when that data is available? I'm sure Zach could have picked this up anyone, but just can that be shared with the committee?
So I'll check our legal arrangements with the companies, but yeah, I completely
maybe just the headline data of
Sure.
Say it's 12% of complaints at the moment. How many new complaints have been received? Perhaps I can't see why there'd be a legal issue with that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Assembly Member Best. Catherine, if I can look at Solar Skills London, how many businesses or Londoners has the Solar Skills London reached since its creation?
That is a very good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, and I might need to look towards Chet for it. I know that we've put in place, I think we put £63,000, £68,000 in the first phase of Solar Skills London. That was developing a solar PV curriculum, a careers hub, a small training grant scheme for solar installers. And then in the second phase, we've put £63,000 towards it. That launched last month. and that is supporting new entrants into the solar industry in London to increase the number of certified installers and doing kind of outreach and promotion of the industry. But in terms of the numbers who have gone through that programme, I'm afraid I don't have them to hand. Don't know if Chet can add anything.
I haven't seen those numbers either, so we can see if those are available through through the partners who are running that.
Yeah, predictably, because that's about £130,000 to make it. If you could write to us with how many Londoners or businesses that's reached, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Syed, if I can turn to you, I've got another one of those very simple and easy questions, which is what can the mayor do to increase solar capacity in London? But don't feel like you need to repeat yourself. We've heard several kind of recommendations, but it's just an opportunity really. If there's something that hasn't been touched on that you think we really need to hear, then absolutely all is.
Well, just to mention that when 7-8 years ago, the government did actually issue a challenge to the public sector to install across the UK 1 gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts of solar PV. After I think the 2015 election, we've had so many recently, I forget exactly when, but that kind of that plea kind of, or that commitment to work between central government, local government was dropped. So I think it goes back to a point I made earlier. It's not clear across the boroughs to what level of commitment they have to look and put on solar on their sites. But by and large, most boroughs are looking to deliver their climate action plan in the first instance by reducing the carbon impact of their own buildings. It would be good to find out what capacity that would be over London, what support they need. Are there routes, if they were procuring things collectively, they'll get a better deal themselves, a solar together for the public sector, and also looking beyond local authorities to the wider public sector, to things like hospitals, leisure centres and so on. So it's that convening and leadership power of the mayor to work with the wider public sector in London to see what can be done on solar, because at the moment it's very piecemeal.
And looking at the question slightly in reverse, what can the mayor do to encourage and increase take-up among Londoners for solar capacity in terms of wanting them in the homes or businesses, I suppose?
Yeah, I think in some respects, as much power as the mayor may wield, that energy prices are really driving that forward. But case studies will be helpful. There's nothing better than actually finding out someone down your road is saving £500-600 a year because they've done energy efficiency in solar. Some best, and because Catherine's mentioned, we're getting increasing number of households with solar together. Hopefully, a number of very happy customers are there. It would be great if we had a solar streets program where we could identify one solar user across different boroughs who might want to open their house to explain how well their bills have been reduced. And of course, their bills will be reduced now more than ever before because electricity prices are going up. So there could be ways in which we could have a solar day in London where those households could be opened up to kind of talk about solar to local groups. And with my Community Energy London hat on, we'd be more than happy to kind of spread that message as well. But there's nothing better than seeing and doing to motivate householders to go and do it themselves. And we're not really doing that. I'm looking at where I live in North London. Do I know how? I know roughly how many solar there is about, and I know some neighbours who've got it. When I've gone in and found out about it, it's been fantastic. And that's for me, who knows an awful lot about solar. There are lots of nuances, but we don't kind of proselytise that more widely across our neighbourhoods. If we did that, that would have a really powerful effect, I think.
Thank you. A solar day sounds brilliant. You're like a recommendation machine today. That's very helpful. Just before we move into our final section on community energy, so I just want to pick up with something you said at the very beginning of the meeting. A siren went past my window, so I may have just missed it, but you were talking about Teddington and a group that were doing hydro, and you said that there was an oil and gas company nearby, and that's what put them out of business. But I didn't quite hear, was the reason just competitive prices, or I didn't hear the end part of the story?
No, and again, I think the best thing to do is to direct you to Ham Hydro's website, because they give a kind of root and branch explanation of what happened. But effectively, their plan application went through several stages, but the social club of a local organisation complained about the development going ahead which scuppered the whole project. And I was very disappointed at the time because I know how many passionate people there were who'd given up literally thousands of hours of volunteer time to get that project off the ground. The planning decision went away with them. And just one thing that I'll mention in the community energy section, the hardest thing about community energy is getting a group of individuals together to think about the projects. Never mind the projects or securing the funding or anything, is getting people together to agree to work together. After Ham Hydro project was scuppered, the group effectively fell apart. And that was a real shame, because if that project had gone ahead, I'm in no doubt West London would have benefited from a whole host of other projects, not only hydro, because that group of individuals been spurred on to deliver yet more good things in that area. But they fell off, and I don't blame them for wanting to walk away from it all.
Yeah, that sounds like a huge opportunity missed. But on that, it's a nice segue to Assembly Member Dockari.
Thank you so much, Syed. You've touched on this so many times now throughout the committee about community energy, and there seems to be what I want to talk about a little bit before I move on to the first question that I was originally on. You talked about the need to encourage engagement earlier, about how you communicate, seeing good examples everywhere. And what I'd like to know is, how do we encourage that community engagement with specific communities that should be engaged but aren't engaged? There's a charity that you're probably well aware of, Centre for Sustainable Energy, and they use, these are their words, middle class areas tend to be more engaged with these community projects. What do we need to do to make sure that we are engaging with the community groups that really do need to be more involved? And what are the problems in this particular area? And how do we make sure that we're doing better?
Okay, well, first of all, that's an excellent question. And just to say that the Centre for Sustainable Energy is my go-to place to nick ideas from, but that's a secret, so don't tell anybody else, please. But
it's out now.
CSE in Bristol are just excellent, and they've had 20 to 30 years of experience of working with their local community there. So that's a great example. So that increasing the diversity of Londoners who are involved in community energy is the very heart of what Community Energy London has been focusing on the last 18 months. It's absolutely critical that the benefits of these energy projects, as we go through the energy transition, is benefited by all Londoners. Now, many groups, prior to Community Energy London existence, many groups have been doing this already with their communities. So Repowering London, which I'm also the chair of, is an excellent example of doing this around Lambeth, and they've been working and expanding on their skills in North Kensington around where the Grenfell disaster took place, and they're now extending their reach into East London. There are other examples with SE24 Energy, South East London Community Energy, Power at North London. Virtually every group, you may well say they came from a group of individuals who've got the time and the skills and expertise to start entering into the community energy foray in the first place. But London is made up of loads of communities, and these groups know that more than anybody else, and they reach out to help those families and those individuals to kind of find out about what they're doing, participate, invest in projects. And one of the key things I really talk about the energy transition is to try and get communities to get really engaged in this significant transformation that we're going to undergo in London, where I would say we're going to have the very crucible of the energy transformation in terms of solar, in terms of EVs, in terms of storage, in terms of new smart energy tariffs. Really is to tell parents that their kids have an opportunity to get a job in this sector. And where we can do that, it's a win-win, because we can help in terms of the education, we can help in terms of the training, we can help in terms of that pipeline of individuals to those companies. We can bring companies into working in central London where they may choose not to do so. We can get parents to invest in projects through their money and actually welcome these kind of technologies into their household. Just to say, in 2010, there were only a few thousand PV installation on homes in the whole of Britain. Now we've got something like 1.5 million. 10 years ago, nobody really thought about EVs or energy storage or smart tariffs or even solar panels. By the end of this decade, I'd argue vast amounts of people are going to have all of those in their household as a matter of course. And then we're going to move on to yet more amazing technologies around the Internet of Things and white goods and AI in terms of energy tariffs and smart meters doing lots of things, switching automatically on your behalf as a customer. All of this is going to happen as a matter of course, but the key thing is we have to handhold customers, because that 10% of Solar Together customers who may not be happy, if they tell somebody else, that stops solar in those areas. And this transformation is not a one-off. It's something that's going to take place over a decade, and we need to handhold households to make sure they get the best of what's going on. And that includes in more diverse households, those areas where it's more poorer, where they're feeling the real brunt of the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned the cost of living crisis, because do you think that's where the communication could be improved? It's not just about energy to save the environment, but it's also cost efficiency as well. And these particular families will benefit not just in terms of how it's going to benefit the planet, but for their own budget, for their own, the amount of money that they would save from that. Is that something that you think we're missing out on pushing more on?
Absolutely right. I mean, I should say we've been talking an awful lot about, in the context of this particular meeting, about renewable power generation. In terms of Community Energy London, we've appointed a recent fuel poverty coordinator with support from the GLA. Many of the groups have already been working on advising households in terms of the best tariff they can be on, energy efficiency measures they can access, also acting as an intermediary between them and an energy company when they've got a backup in terms of debt on their energy bills, also helping households who through the pandemic couldn't get to their local shop to top up their prepaid meters. So community energy is more than just about generation per se. It's working with those neighbourhoods to make sure, and those households, to make sure they get the best out of their energy deals, and then take them on the next step, which may well be generation for some households. So yeah, alleviation of fuel poverty, energy efficiency advice, getting the best deal for your energy bill is absolutely key to what community energy is doing. London, I would say, is an exemplar in doing this, because the scale of the challenge in London is more concentrated than many other parts of the country.
Do you have kind of any data or evidence about some of the projects that are going ahead within the next 12 months to do with community projects that you can share with us?
Yeah, yes, we do. I'm sure many of you have got massive experience working with community groups, and the term herding cats springs to mind every now and again. Getting data out of them is a real challenge. Luckily, we have the London Community Energy Fund, which has really helped deliver a pipeline of projects, and that's well documented in terms of the groups, the projects, and when they've actually been delivered. Increasingly, one of the things that takes up a lot of my time is, after we work with the Mayor to create the London Community Energy Fund, we're now working with boroughs to encourage them to develop their own community energy programs. So just to say, in the last 3 months, in May, Hounslow launched a community energy fund. In June, Hackney launched a community energy fund. And 10 days ago, Southwark launched their own community energy fund. This is not only about money, but this is about having a set of policies within your climate action plan to try and encourage local community groups to get into climate action work in their borough. This is really critical, because as we at local authority or regional government level say, somebody in Whitehall can't easily always dictate down to cities and regions about what can be done. Equally, some people in regional government or in local authorities can't always reach down to the community. And so community groups are a great intermediary in trying to do that. Because again, just to reiterate, this is not a one-off. This is a journey for the next 10 to 15 years for households to hit net zero. And where things go wrong, it's a real problem, and we're trying to help stop that.
Catherine, I can see your hand up, but I'm also quite glad that you got your hand up, because I'd like to know how the Mayor is ensuring that we don't lose the good work that Syed's just talked about, that could be lost if we don't keep an eye on this and scrutinise it and keep and have that data and evidence. I don't want to lose all this great work that we're doing, you know, if it does take such a long time, like 10 years time. How do we make sure that we ensure that all that fantastic work isn't lost?
Thank you. Well, the future of programmes is perhaps a question for budget discussions, although it's nice to get that positive feedback. But maybe just to come back to an earlier question, which was about the, is it essentially middle class areas which are engaged? That's not what we see from the from the London Community Energy Fund. The first 4 phases, when we've looked at where we've funded projects across London and how, you know, whether it's a low income area, high income area, on average it was comparable to the London average. So, you know, we hit a span of different types of neighbourhood, different community groups, and in terms of the index of multiple deprivation, we were squarely at the average level. So, you know, one could argue that we should do better at targeting groups that are, you know, particularly in need, and we are trying to do more outreach and engagement with that, but it wasn't skewed towards the you know, the wealthier parts of the community, I guess. So worth saying that. And then just in terms of the enthusiasm that we've seen for these sorts of projects, we've now run 5 rounds of applications for London Community Energy Fund, and we've awarded 126 projects, of which 49 have been since last November. So, you know, it has been an increased amount of enthusiasm that we've seen, particularly in that last wave, which is really good news for us.
Brilliant. Well, I'm really sorry if I've gone into Tony's question slightly there, but I'm sure Tony can extend further.
Thank you. I think I've got an intervention from Assemblymember Cooper first of all.
Thank you, Chair. It was a question for Saeed, really, and it's about the Community Energy Fund. Obviously, we had the Urban Community Energy Fund was scrapped now some years ago, and luckily I know, can I just also say thank you very much, because I know I wasn't the only person bending the Mayor's ear about replacing it with a London Community Energy Fund, but I know that you and lots of the people from Community Energy London and from the groups also bent his ear before the 2016 election and have continued to prove since 2016 the worth of that fund. And obviously we're now just more recently losing the Rural Community Energy Fund. And I just wondered if you could say how much further ahead you think we would have been if we kept, you know, there were small budgets, the 2 community energy funds that came nationally. How much further ahead do you think we might have been in London if those small budgets had continued? And where would we be if the Mayor had not stepped in with his London Community Energy Fund, basically, you know, replacing the one that the government decided to scrap? Because I think this is really critical for where we are now in the cost of living crisis. We could be a lot further ahead, couldn't we?
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant question. So just very, very quickly, a few points. So the government established something called the Rural Community Energy Fund in something like 2012, 2013. There was a group of community groups who were advising government, and they said, why is it only rural? Why can there not be an urban one? The government agreed, and they said, let's set up an urban community energy fund, which was £10 million. Unfortunately, the terms of reference for application were more or less the same as the Rural Community Energy Fund. And back to the very beginning of this meeting, you can't really have wind turbines in London, so the actual funding and the shape of the funding needed to be changed, and it wasn't. After, I think, the 2015 election, that fund, which still had 8 million in it, in the pot, the Urban Community Energy Fund, was prematurely axed, and it's never been looked back at again. The Rural Community Energy Fund was also axed, but it came back into being in about 2018. It's been operated for the last 3-4 years, a big chunk of money. If we'd had that, it's absolutely fantastic. The Mayor has given close to 1.5 million, I think, through the 5 rounds of the London Community Energy Fund, but the Urban Community Energy Fund was around about 7 times bigger than that. So it would be really great if USEF came back, but it also, if the Mayor had the fair share of London's portion for that. But just to say, so on your question, where would we would be even better off than where we are at the moment, and London is an absolute pathfinder for community energy compared to the rest of the country. Just to say, the Rural Community Energy Fund has recently been axed. Unfortunately, doing Community Energy Fortnight, which is probably not the best time for a government to axe a fund during the sector's kind of week or fortnight celebrating the sector. That was one thing. Secondly, the government have said the levelling up funds will be the route for community groups now to support projects. Many of you may know the levelling up funds better than I do, but I was asking colleagues at the GLA of this recently. Hardly any of the levelling up funds apply to London, apart from the Sharing Prosperity Fund, which I know the GLA is making their submission shortly to government. And I'd be really, really grateful if the GLA could make sure that within the Sharing Prosperity Fund, community energy or community climate action is mentioned, so there'll be an opportunity to tap into that funding. So yeah, the LSEP has been the real saviour, and I think at the last Community Energy England Awards ceremony, London nearly wiped the board, because we've got all the projects here in London because of the good work we've been doing with the Mayor and extending it through the boroughs. And just to say, the Mayor's help has helped accelerate our discussion with the boroughs and given them the confidence to see projects, and then they've come forward with their own support programs. And lastly, that other point I mentioned, the real reason we argued for the London Community Energy Fund was if you've got a bunch of willful individuals who want to spend their time in the evening developing these projects, that's the hardest bit of any community group. And if that withers and dies, it's very, very hard to create it again. But recently we've seen Cali Energy in Islington, Croydon Community Energy in Croydon, we're seeing new groups come forward. That's really positive. Thanks, Leonie.
I mean, I just think it's just so sad to listen to what Syed was saying. And I know the Assembly Member Polanski, the chair, will probably think that I'm just trying to big up the mayor here, but actually the Secretary of State between 2010 and 2015, who was the person who oversaw the launch of the community energy strategy, was Ed Davey, who's now the leader of the Liberal Democrats. And I think we owe him a big thumbs up. And I can see actually that as I said, that Assembly Member Bakari was literally doing a thumbs up. But then the mayor did step in, and I would give a plea to those people who are on this call, who are listening, who are members of the Conservative Party, and obviously that includes some of the Assembly members. Do make these points to the people who are currently putting themselves forward in the leadership contest. We really need support from all political parties, because we're never going to tackle the climate emergency. And I have heard one of the candidates talking about the jobs that flow from this, but it is also addressing the cost of living crisis, and it's really critical. And we can't do it without support from all parties. That is obvious, because it got cut after 2015 when it became a majority Conservative administration. So thank you to Ed Davey and also to the Mayor for the work they've done. Let's hope everyone else joins in. Sorry to be a tiny bit political there, Chair. Thank you.
That's okay. I'm not sure if I've been given an opportunity to defend the government, but I shall pass on that. Syed, I saw your hand go up.
Just briefly to say that, we've had a number of councils from different political colours support community energy, including Kensington and Chelsea, who have been extremely helpful recently as well. And, that's been really positive. We're looking to extend that and to other boroughs across London. So, just to mention the message has been getting through.
True. Local government and regional government getting it right. We just need central government to step up on this one.
Yeah, and just to mention, of course, our current energy minister is Greg Hands, who's also an MP for Kensington and Chelsea. It would be great to get Mr. Hands to come and visit some sites and kind of support community energy a bit more volubly in central government. Thanks.
Thank you. Good to end there with praise for all parties. And I would point out that the Green Party have been talking about this for years too. That's for politics over and done with. Assembly Member Devenish, if you could finish off the meeting.
I will. And if you want to go and visit Greg Hands, by all means, write to him and copy me. He's fantastic at getting out there, and he's a very, very good minister. And on the Conservative Home website, you'll see a wonderful article from Kensington and Chelsea Council on this very subject by Johnny Thalassisis, councillor on this very subject. So there you go. So me and Leonie can agree sometimes. There you go. My final two questions, Syed, I think you've probably already answered this, but I'll just ask you again. If there's anything you haven't covered, is there anything more the Mayor could do to increase the amount of community energy projects in London? And 2 points I would make is one, almost echoing AM Bakari's comments, I think we need to talk about the cost of living far more. I don't ever hear the Mayor talk about the cost of living, apart from when he's asking the government for more money in the general round. Maybe he could actually have lots of branding in terms of all this work that's being done on the London Underground, for example. So maybe you could address that, please. But I'm not sure if there's anything else you'd like to find. Your final chance to raise anything, Saeed, and thank you for your comments and everybody else's comments today.
Thank you, Tony. I think with specifically the mayor, I think two things spring to mind in the first instance. One, the London Community Energy Fund has been excellent, as we've said, but it would be great if the mayor could shout out a little bit more about it. So, you know, we haven't seen a specific press release on the great work that has been done by the groups. And, you know, Catherine mentioned the number of projects that have been supported. So if we were to see a further round of funding, which we've been liaising with GLA officers about through a survey of the members to shape hopefully a further round of funding, it would be really great if the mayor could go and visit another community energy site. The last site he did visit, but it got slightly lost in the press release, was in Acton, as part of around about 17 installations in West London that have gone through community energy groups on schools. So one thing would be the mayor shouting out about it, writing to typical kind of organisations that install community energy, such as schools. We've got a very active programme with schools at the moment, but it's kind of got haphazard in terms of schools finding out about community energy. And so, yeah, so the kind of proselytising bit for the mayor will be really helpful in the first instance. The second bit to that as well is, we mentioned, probably you noticed a slight bugbear of mine is TfL. They have lots and lots of buildings. If they could identify somewhere they are not interested in installing solar, and I should say the solar the groups do tend to be smaller. They have ambitions to be bigger, but some of these solar sites, because they're small, is because they're not attractive to commercial developers. They don't make it in terms of the rate of return for commercial developers, but they do in terms of the social value lens that the community groups look at. So pass over some buildings to community groups on a peppercorn rent to actually develop the solar. And we've mentioned the fire brigade and the police have already done quite well, which is why I'm targeting TfL, because I presume there's more buildings that the TfL have that could do that. So that's the second thing. On the cost of living crisis, I think there is no magic bullet on this. You know, when bills are going up to £3,000, if you can save £100 or £150, that's great. But this time last year, the bills were £1,200. So we're getting not far off a 2.5 times increase. But again, many local authorities and the mayor are developing programs, involve community energy groups. To their credit, central government has had a once in a generation amount of money to help retrofit homes. An awful lot of that is still to be allocated in the next spending review, but local authorities who have been the recipients of this funding should work with community groups to get that money down to householders as quickly as possible. The local groups know where the households are most in need. They can provide a pipeline up to local authorities to try and help those homes get retrofitted. The commitment by the national government in the 2019 manifesto was £9.3 billion. Of that £9.3 billion, about £6 billion was for housing. Of that £6 billion for housing, about £2 billion has been allocated. So we still have £4 billion of money coming back to retrofit homes. An awful lot of that will probably be funneled through local authorities. If that's the case, local authorities use the community groups to help deploy these programs as quickly as possible on the ground in London.
Thank you. Could I ask maybe either you or Catherine to write to the committee with some examples of average paybacks? Because although I agree with AM Cooper that sometimes you need what we used to call government grant to subsidise things, the way the PV pricing's gone down, actually a lot of this thing does actually stack up now, and paybacks have gone down from, I think, on average, is 11 or 12 years when I was doing this stuff 15 years ago to 6 or 7 years, but my figures may be out of date. So that'd be quite useful to have some worked examples that actually you can, particularly if you're doing this over 20 odd years, you can actually make money on this. And my final point, and then I will be quiet, is whether Chatham Lad has any final comments. I think we may have also covered this, but I'll just ask my final question, which is, how is the GLA ensuring that Community Energy Fund reaches the low income areas? But again, I think AM Bakari and guests covered that earlier. But if you've got anything finally you want to say, Chetan, or I'll hand back to the chair.
So let me jump in very quickly on that paper point. You're quite right, Tony, which is why I raised the issue with Leonie Cooper that we don't really need feed-in tariffs anymore. It's a regressive kind of tax effectively on energy bills. And as a consequence of that, we think that if the system for installing solar was made more efficient, that would bear reach into wide areas across London. We don't really need the feed-in tariff. So I just mentioned that there in terms of the payback element. I will liaise with groups to try and come up with a couple of work calculations, which I'll submit to the committee in the next few weeks, the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Chetan, did you have anything you wanted to say? I think you probably answered it earlier.
I can pick up. I think Catherine covered much of this ground earlier in terms of the first 4 rounds as reach across the spectrum. The LSEF, our Community Energy Fund, it supports community groups who put into community funds that support low-income Londoners. So an example is we support community energy groups like South East London Community Energy, so Chelsea with and Crew Energy, so who offer things like energy cafes, which are events that offer advice on how to help households use less energy and save on their bills. Also, we're working with Chelsea to get them to help us identify households that can be put forward for the Mayor's Warmer Homes programme to help them sort of insulate and or have energy saving measures in their homes for the most low income households as well. So those are some of the things that we're doing. I think Catherine sort of got a hand up as well.
Go on, Catherine, you have the final words.
Very kind. Just to say on the cost of living, I'll also plug the Warmer Homes programme that Chet mentioned, and in a balanced fashion mentioned that £40 million of it comes from central government, from Department for Business, and we deliver it on their behalf. But that pays for energy efficiency measures. It can pay for better ventilation, which is good both when you're overheating and keeping you warm in winter, tackling drafts, insulation and solar energy as well. So we've got a big challenge to invest all of that this year. The Mayor does talk about it a lot in the context of cost of living and how he can help, how the GLA can help. So your assistance in advertising that to low income Londoners in low energy efficiency homes would be really gratefully appreciated.
Thank you. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to our guests on one of the hottest days ever in history for answering 2.5 hours of questions. Very much appreciated. Catherine and Chetan, thank you for your transparency and also for the amount of commitments that you've agreed to. We realise that we've fired a lot of questions with you, and I'm sure you, as I can see, you both know it's important. Syed, speaking in a personal capacity, I think you're one of the best guests I've seen on a committee ever. You've given huge amounts of information, really good recommendations, and we've very, very much appreciated you as a committee having you. So thank you to all 3 of you. That was a really exceptional, excellent session. Thank you. And we've now reached the end of the Q&A session. I would like to thank our guests. I've just done that. The committee has a few more items of business to deal with, but please feel free to leave the Zoom call while we deal with those, or you can stay for the excitement if you wish. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Thank you. Environment Committee.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry. Bye.
No problem.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme for the 2022-2023 Assembly year and the topics agreed at the GLA Oversight Committee on 13th of July?
Noted.
Thank you. The next meeting of the Environment Committee is scheduled for 14th of September 2022 at 2 p.m. in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.